you on this Tuesday Diwan. It's been a tradition to discuss a lot of ideas that share a big intersection with lots of the work that you've been doing before over the last few years. So it's a personal privilege and honor to have you here with us today and share this discussion. And it's a delight for all of us, I think, and many of my colleagues share the same excitement to have you with us. I'll introduce for our colleagues and friends who might not be familiar with yourself. Jonathan is an independent scholar. He is focused on he's focused on problems of intellectual history, questions of epistemology, and the sociology of knowledge, and holds a PhD in sociology. He's an author of a number of books on this subject, including first, The House of Wisdom, How the Arabs Transformed the Western Civilization, I believe first published in 2009. Also the Islam Through Western Eyes, From the Crusades to the War on Terror, and also the Society for Useful Knowledge, How Benjamin Franklin and his friends brought the Enlightenment to America. Jonathan, before he authored those books, have had the first-hand experience of the Muslim world through working with Reuters as a correspondent and an editor in the Muslim world, in Iran, in Turkey, and other places as well. Tonight, the discussion will be first 20 to 30 minutes, which Jonathan will share his ideas and thoughts on Islam, science, and the West. And then we'll open the floor for a discussion with our colleagues and friends. And since it's the first time we're going to use this platform, the method could be either, I believe, raising a hand, just pressing on the button where you raise your hand, and we'll get a turn in asking the question, opening, and so we can just have some form of order in terms of participations and inputs from our friends. And if you choose to do that, you can be unmuted and provide direct input, or alternatively, we can have the question, or you can have the question posted, and we will be moderating the questions, and Jonathan can take them in the relevant order. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Jonathan. I'll stop my camera just for the sake of connection, and we'll catch up after the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talal, and greetings to everyone out there. It's late morning here in Portland. I think some of you are up quite late, so I appreciate that. I'm going to speak today about Islam, science, and the West. And I know that I'm speaking to an audience that's quite knowledgeable about the history of Islam, the intellectual history of the Islamic world. So I'm going to focus on a slightly different angle at the outset, and that is history of science as a discipline and its relationship to our understanding of the Muslim world and Islamic civilization. Now, I think that it's important to understand that history of science, when considering, discussing, writing about the Muslim world, has two serious obstacles that need to be addressed. The first one is specific not to Islam, but to the idea of history of science. And I'll be very brief. In essence, the problem as I see it is that historians of science are almost all trained to some degree in Western science and see Western science, that is modern science, as an end goal. So the history that they write is very teleological in that it moves towards the goal of the present. And the only way it can get us to the present is to go back and look at the past through the lens of the present. Now, what does that mean? That means that those scientific achievements, those developments, those inventions, however you want to term it, those breakthroughs that contribute to what we today agree on a consensus basis is modern science, they get the scholarly attention. So history of science is not the history of science writ large, in my view. History of science is how did we get from somewhere, we're not sure where, to where we are today. We do know where we are today. So what's the result? The result is that historical traditions that did not, for whatever reason, and there are many, many reasons that are not engaged with their intellectual worth or capacity or success, but have to do with culture, with history, sociology, did not feed directly into our current understanding of modern science, are slighted, or they're brushed aside, or often they're ignored, or if they're not ignored, they're downplayed. And now Islamic science, which has a great tradition, as you know, and I will go into some of that, is not the only victim. Mayan science, Hindu science, Chinese science, they're all treated as kind of curious backwaters, sidelines, detours on the route to Western-oriented modern science. So right away we have a problem when we want to talk about Islamic science in an intelligent, meaningful way. So that's the first problem. The second problem has to do with the Western attitudes, ideas, discourse, if you will, what I call the anti-Islam discourse, the Western idea of Islam. And Talal very kindly mentioned some of my books in the Islam Through Western Eyes, which began as my PhD dissertation and was later published by Columbia University Press. I explain the evolution of the entire idea within the West of the Muslim world. I won't go into that now, though we can talk in detail during the Q&A if that's of interest. But in essence, my argument is that the West really has no idea, for historical, sociological, institutional, and political reasons. The West has no real idea of what Islam or the Islamic world is really all about. So to recapitulate, when we go back and say we are going to discuss as Westerners or in a Western tradition, history of science, history of Islamic science, we have two problems already. We have the institutional problem that all history of science suffers from. And if I could just amplify that briefly, take another field that I know quite well, history or sociology of religion. I think you would find, if you surveyed leading sociologists of religion, that some are religious and some are not. But religion, or a given faith, perhaps Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever it is not taken as the rational endpoint of the enterprise. But when you look at history of science, as I mentioned, the end goal is where we are today, what our understanding of science is today. And so anything that contributed to that has historical value. Anything that did not, and here I'm thinking of perhaps the great Arab and Chinese and other traditions of, say, astrology or of alchemy, they're not really treated seriously in the history of science, in my opinion, certainly not by academics. So we have these two problems. Before I go on, I should define my terms just a little bit, because after all, even though I generally write for a non-specialist audience, at the end of the day, I am an academic. So let me just say, why do I call Arab science? What do I mean by Islamic science? And I've had a lot of criticism from Turks and Persians, Iranians, and other people about my use of this language. So I don't want to be defensive, but I want to explain that for me, the blanket term Arab science, Islamic science, in the historical context are essentially interchangeable, because these were Arab-dominated cultures. Yes, the Abbasid Empire shifted to a Persian land, but the writing was almost exclusively in Arabic, the scientific writing. The culture was, the dominant political culture was Arabic. So it's a tough choice. We have to make these choices. So I hope you'll allow me to make that particular choice. But I do, in my writings, acknowledge the great contribution of Central Asians, of Turkish background, of Persians, Zoroastrians, Sabians, and other groups, not just sort of Arab Muslims. Okay, let's get that out of the way. Let me give you one quick example of the way in which these two problems I mentioned at the outset distort our understanding of Islamic science. And that has to do with the exercise of translation. If you pick up a Western textbook, say for college students about world civilizations, or even a lot of serious history of knowledge, history of science books, Arab Islamic contribution is seen as translating, having translated the Greek texts, the Roman texts, into Arabic, preserved them, and then Europe comes in and the great drama translates them back into Latin and eventually into vernacular languages. Now, the great scholar of Islamic science, George Saliba at Columbia University, calls this the classical narrative of Islamic science. In other words, the Arabs, the Muslims were caretakers. Now, if you get engaged with the subject, as I've tried to do, you find that this is absurd. What the word translation means to the Western ear is you take a text, you turn it into Arabic, and then you turn it back into Latin. That's not at all what happened. We know that when the Arab institutions, especially what came to be known as the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and other cultural centers, started translating the texts, and at one point they translated virtually all known extant Greek and Latin, particularly Greek works of philosophy, into Arabic. We know that they weren't passive translators. They improved the text. When it came to astronomy, they tested the various data, they updated the data. So what emerged in Arabic was far superior to what had been done in the Greek classical era. And as a result, the Arab contribution is kind of missed because in the translation, the early stage of translation from Arabic to Latin included these improvements. But then we had the Renaissance and the rise of the humanities, and humanities scholars in the city-states of Italy and France, later in England. What did they do? They didn't want any of this Arab stuff. In fact, they saw it as degenerate, as a violation of classical knowledge. And so they went back to the original Greek texts and translated those into Latin. So they effectively lost, and we have examples, hundreds of years of scholarly contribution by Arab and Muslim intellectuals because they decided the Arab translations weren't going to be good as the so-called Greek originals, but in fact the Arab translations were often far improved. Second question we have to ask is, when we speak about Islamic science, the history of Islamic science, what do we actually know? I have seen estimates that there are perhaps hundreds of thousands of scientific manuscripts in the main Islamic languages of Turkish, Urdu, Arabic, and Persian, to name a few, essentially going to waste, discarded, unread, unstudied in archives and libraries and private collections. So scholars don't even know, I would argue, the full extent of Islamic science. And yet we have a historical narrative that tells us what we think or what we need to know about Islamic science. So one of the key differences when considering Islamic science is to get away from the Western notion. And you'll notice I keep talking about Western notions, and I know I'm speaking to an audience that's not necessarily that as engaged in that tradition as someone like myself who grew up in the West, was educated at American and Australian universities. But what we know is that much of scholarship worldwide is highly influenced by the trends, intellectual trends, techniques, pedagogy of Western thought. Many of the leading, this is starting to change, but for decades, for generations, the leading Arab and Muslim intellectuals were often trained, at least partially, if not wholly, in Paris, in London, in New York, in the States in general. So when I talk about Western science, I'm not talking geographic, I'm talking about as a concept. Now, the biggest change, one of the biggest things that's often overlooked by Western scholars of Islamic science is the degree to which Islam and religion were not, as they were arguably in the Western context, in opposition to one another. In fact, when you look at the biographies of some of the great early Muslim scholars, Al-Khwarizmi comes to mind, so many others, they either had religious training, were religious scholars themselves, or wrote text for the religious community. There was not this necessary tension between religion and science. That is a Western-generated narrative, then applied, I would argue, inappropriately to the Islamic world. Of course, there were tensions as the Islamic world, particularly in the medieval period, which is my focus, science jump-started by some work from the Greeks and by Hindu scholars, and then a totally organic intellectual enterprise of Arabs, Persians, Turks, and other Muslims. There were tensions, particularly over the idea of astrology, because astrology, of course, makes some claims that would violate the monotheist idea of God, all-powerful God, which Muslims, Jews, and Christians share. The astrologer is kind of claiming on some level to be able to see or predict the future, and that was often seen as a violation of human restrictions or human limitations and interfering with God's world. But in general, the Islamic world did not experience the kind of tension between the religious scholars and the scientific, the new science. So let's look at a few examples in the ways in which Islam as a faith and science as an enterprise cooperated. If they're not competing, let's see how much they cooperated. So for example, you all know well that to be a good Muslim, you must know the direction of Mecca. Well, in the early Islamic years, when the community was very much focused in the Arabian Peninsula, this was pretty easy. Everybody knew which way Mecca was. And if you were in Medina, you turn south, there you are. But as Arab and Muslim influence spread across the world, you got communities, Muslim communities, further and further out into distant lands. And so the Muslims of Central Asia, the Muslims of China, the Muslims in North Africa needed to know how to orient themselves for prayer. This is not a simple question. You can sort of imagine, okay, it's in this direction or it's in this direction. But what's interesting about Islam is, and the history of Islam, is the way in which the new scholars, the geometers, the map makers, the geographers, were able to direct the community and win the argument that, well, Mecca is not actually in the common sense crow flies direction, but that the shortest distance over the curve of the earth is actually the proper orientation for prayer. So you may imagine, if you're in the modern context on an airplane, I live in Portland, Oregon, in the extreme northwest of the United States. If I want to fly to the Middle East, the plane is going to go up over the pole because that's the shortest distance, will save the most time and the most fuel, cost the least to the airline company. Essentially, the scientists of the medieval period won that same argument and said, well, the shortest direction to Mecca is the proper orientation for prayer. And there are plenty of other aspects of Muslim practice that require some sophisticated understanding of the physical world. So we have the 5 daily prayers. Well, there's a lot of folk wisdom on how you tell when the prayers are, but over time, there evolved a very organized scientific community that was able to chart out, predict, and publish almanacs, which is, of course, an Arabic word, that would tell the believers from China to North Africa and everywhere in between what time the prayer should be on a given day, taking into account the geographic differences, the movement of the planets, the position of the earth vis-a-vis the sun. And again, there was no real pushback from the religious scholars. They accepted this as a natural part of their faith. Now, we have some examples of the way the Qibla, the direction of prayer of Mecca, was established in different communities. Historically, before the scientists kind of won this argument, there was the classic, well, we know the road to Mecca goes this way, so that's good enough for us. there's this early Islamic tradition based on the Prophet's life after moving to Medina that facing south gets you to Mecca, so people in distant points would face south. Some adapted qiblas from the fairly arbitrary position that some early mosques had. And the fourth option was to, well, let's leave it up to the astronomers. And over time, this became the predominant method. So here we have a very important aspect of religious practice in Islam, working with, acceding to the opinion of scientists, in this case, astronomers, on how to find the direction of Mecca. Now, so one of the greatest examples of early mathematical geography was written by al-Biruni in the 11th century. And what was his purpose was to find the direction of Mecca from a city, Qazvin, in Afghanistan. And he wrote The Determination of the Coordinates of Cities, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the first work in history to determine accurate geographic locales with the techniques of spherical geometry. I should notice that by the 9th century, all the 6 trigonometric functions, so you might remember from high school mathematics, sine, cosine, tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant were known. Only the first, the sine, was an import from Hindu mathematics. All the other derivatives were done by Islamic scholars. And this was important because it allowed them to use calculation in the place of geometric diagrams, and really helped pave the way for the early development of mathematical astronomy. Another place we see Islam and religion working together very effectively were in the mosques, where we had a tradition, particularly in Egypt, of mosque timekeepers. They were professional scientists who regulated the calls to prayer and the time for prayer. They also built astronomical instruments. They worked on the publication and production of these almanacs, which listed the time of prayer. And in Cairo, for example, there are 200 pages of special tables were available to keep time by the sun and other celestial markers, and they taught students as well. As you know, Islamic injunction include the requirement that we heal the sick, and this provided great impetus to the study of medicine and the practice of surgery. The Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca created an enormous need, particularly as the Islamic world expanded, for cartography and navigation. Speculation among Sufi mystics on the transformation of the soul in union with God helped fuel the alchemists' search for a way to transform base metal. This laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. And the Muslim princes, no less than their Christian counterparts, relied heavily on complex reading from astrologers. Even many of the foods that the entire world now enjoys, artichokes, orange, and apricots, and much of the Western technical vocabulary, I'm thinking of words like algebra, azimuth, zero, all come from Arab lands. So this was detail, but to step back a minute, I'd like to focus briefly on what I reckon is the single most important contribution of Arab and Islamic science to global culture. And that is this idea that man himself or herself was capable of understanding the universe and understanding God's universe and able to interpret it for human benefit. So how did this knowledge that grew up within a religious constituency, how did it find its way to Western Europe? Now, in the House of Wisdom, I tell the story of a particularly interesting young man named Abelard, who came from a community in Bath in the West Country of England. Abelard was one of those unusual figures in history who seemed to defy many of the forces, the factors, and the influences that must have surrounded him. Because he was operating not long after the era of crusades, and yet he decides to go to the Muslim world in search of learning, not in search of military conquest. We don't know very much about Abelard. If any of you have read or have experience with medieval texts, biography, self-promotion, things that we take for granted, sharing information about ourselves, was not intellectually acceptable, was not practiced. And so there's very little biographical or autobiographical information about this young man. But we learn a little bit. We know that he was in Antioch and in Turkey on November 13th, 1114, because there was a big earthquake that we have, which records of which survived. And he talks about surviving the earthquake. So he goes to the Middle East. He learns enough Arabic to absorb at least some of the ideas that are current within learned culture of his new society. And he starts bringing back some of this material to the West. What is he responsible for? Well, he brought star tables, which allow you to tell the time in different locales. He introduced or reintroduced the Western world to Euclidean geometry. He inspired a whole generation or cohort of scholar statesmen, adventurers who go off in search of Arab learning, teach themselves Arabic, or work with Arabic translators to integrate this new knowledge into the East. But again, the most important contribution, it's fun to talk about, he brought Euclid, he brought the astrolabe, but the most important contribution that Abelard and people like him made was this growing realization that humans can understand the world, can study it, and that none of this violates God's commandments, God's desires, God's will towards humans. There's a wonderful line in Adelard's, it's almost a memoir. He writes it as a letter to his probably imaginary cousin, which was a style of the day. And he talks about, he says, quote, "Of course God made the universe, but we may and should inquire into the natural world. The Arabs teach us that." So this is an extremely important moment, I would argue a vital moment in Western history, when the impulse to study the world for its own sake, for knowledge's sake, starts to transition from Islamic world to the broader Western world and then beyond. Now, I talked about at the beginning why this, I should say in writing this book and doing my work, none of this is particularly difficult to find. You can easily learn about the history of Islamic science and its important impact on Western culture. The question I ask as a sociologist is, why don't most people know this? Why House of Wisdom, which was published in 2009 and has since appeared in almost a dozen foreign languages, and is still sold and read in classrooms and by curious general readers, why is that even a book? Why don't we just know the impact, the import of Islamic science? Now, I'm an American. I grew up in the East Coast. I live in the West Coast. When I was in school, which was a long time ago, in grade school in the 60s, early 70s, we were taught the Greek culture, the Greek gods, Greek mythology was very important to Western culture. No one ever mentioned anything about this entire part of the world, the Muslim world, and its enormous impact on the culture that I grew up in. And so my work has mostly focused on two things: documenting, which is the easy part, the impact and the importance of Islamic science on Western culture, and then asking the question, why is no one paying attention? Why is it so hard to convince people? Because it's right there in front of your face if you do any basic research. So I'm going to wrap up my comments with a few ideas about why the West is so reluctant to concede, to acknowledge Islamic contribution. And then I hope we'll have a nice question and answer, and we can talk about different aspects, and I'll respond as best I can. So for one, let's talk about some of the precepts that Western culture imposes on the Islamic world. There's a notion that Islam is conservative, it's hostile to innovation. It's hostile to science, it's hostile to philosophy, it's hostile to, in the modern context, to democracy. Second, when historians of science talk about Islamic science, they almost invariably talk about a so-called golden age. So they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the argument is that the end came in the 12th century when religious backlash, most famously led by al-Ghazali, took hold and choked off Islamic science. Now, in my own surveys of professional friends and colleagues in the West, that seems to be the sort of consensus view. Another obstacle is, and I hinted at it at the beginning, is the role of translation and the idea that Renaissance recovering Western knowledge as opposed to the Renaissance, in my view, assimilating much of Islamic intellectual work in its own context. So the traditional view of the Renaissance is a rebirth. I think the question we need to ask is, what was there to be reborn? There was a very thin playing field, a very small core of knowledge that survived the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. So I'm going to quickly run through some of these, my response to some of these. So I've already mentioned the degree to which Islam found support within science, and science found support within Islam for the work, and they were not seen as naturally towns, regardless of sort of the Western notion that there must be tension between these two. So let me give one last example that I like, that I think is very powerful. You all know, we all know, we're all taught about the Copernican Revolution. Well, what was the so-called Copernican Revolution? It was the publication of an argument that eventually succeeded after much resistance, that the Earth was not the center of the known universe, but in fact the sun. Now, when you look at some of the mathematics that Copernicus uses to prove his point, there are some elements that almost certainly, though not decisively, not assuredly, but almost certainly came from Arab and Muslim astronomy, particularly work being done in Iran after the Mongol invasion of Baghdad. And the question is, how did this stuff get there? Well, most professional historians of science, even though there's evidence that seems pretty convincing to me that there was some interchange, really say no. It was independent development, independent discovery. And my question is not, my argument is not, yes, you're wrong, the Arab influence is clear. My question is, why don't we explore that more seriously? Why are we unable, we being Western scholars, unable to take the possibility that Arab and Muslim astronomy had an enormous influence on what was one of the most important publications in Western history, the notion that the sun, not the earth, and therefore not man's earth, was the center of the universe. Now, many of you, I would say all of you, know the Quran far better than I do, but if you've studied it as closely as I have tried to do, you'll see that the Quran, for example, has many aspects that encourage knowledge, encourage science, and again, undermine this Western thesis that there had to be tension between religion and science. I know there's one Western scholar, Rosenthal, who's done some great translations of Ibn Khaldun and others, estimates that there are 78,000 word references in the Quran to different forms of knowledge. I believe 78,000 is the figure. 78,000 words. 1% of the Quran, 78,000 words, refer to ilm or some form for the word for knowledge. And we know that in a very important hadith, Muhammad says, search for knowledge even in China. So I think I've really touched on the main points that I want to touch on, which is when thinking about Islamic science in a global context, we have two problems. We have history of science only privileges what became Western science, And we have a natural sort of anti-Islam discourse built into Western consciousness. So this makes taking Islamic science extremely difficult. On the other hand, we have enormous evidence of not only a vital scientific culture on the part of the Muslims, but we have the actual transmission belts, if you will, the pathways by which this material moved into the West. We have examples of this material coming to the West and then being slighted, discounted as foreign, alien, subversive, anti-religious, whatever terminology you want to use, replaced with substandard classical wisdom, classical science that then had to be upgraded. And so basically the West costs itself in the field of geography hundreds of years of dead ends because they ignored, downplayed, disregarded the Arab contribution. So for me, the evidence is overwhelming that the Islamic world is extremely important to what we know of as the development of Western culture, and particularly Western scientific culture. So I think I'd like to end there and talk about some of your questions and discussions about whatever you find interesting, or if you have any questions. So I'll hand over to Talal. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me now? Thank you very much for this very informative and very enlightening input. First, yes, I'm gonna ask anyone who has any questions to either raise the hand or press the tab at which you can raise your hand. If you have any questions you'd like to share live through the microphone, or if you have any questions you would like to type in, please feel free to do that. And I'll take the opportunity, since I have the mic, and until folks formulate any questions they might have, and express a few of my own questions. The first time I came across the House of Wisdom, I might have told you this, Jonathan, before, or just coincidentally in a library in the University of Toronto, just by reading through the shelves, and just came across the book and picked it up and started reading. And personally was Adilard's story in particular has been a matter of personal enlightenment. But then again, it's the problem he solves in that statement you said, by reconciling faith and reason, by allowing us or bringing the idea that you can inquire into the natural world. And not only that you can, but you have to inquire into the natural world by divine inspiration or by instruction of God. You not only you have to understand it, but you may understand it, but it's kind of like an obligation for you to inquire into the natural world. The attention that this resolves attention after 1,000 years that we continue to live in now, and particularly in modern science, where there's that notion that anything that is empirical or that's controlled or that's scientific is only deemed to be true, and otherwise anything else wouldn't be fit for that trueness or in whichever definition that would be. There is that form of hegemony, as you might have alluded to in several writings, a hegemony from an epistemological way to what is to be known and how to be, and how things to be known. And I think still 1,000 years onwards, this problem continues to be very, very crucial in the West and by at large in the world as a whole. So how can this be? How can this hegemony be challenged? I would ask. In the current day that we live in, and especially when even Western education systems and Western approach to schooling and or the Western even notion of epistemology is the notion that is being adopted in the Arab world or the Muslim world, or across the world for that matter. How can this be challenged? How this could be transformed back at least to that reconciliation that is much needed?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And as it happens, and this is not a shameless plug for my work, but I am working on a new book, which I hope will try to answer that question, but that's a couple of years away. I'm not sure that there's a way, but I think that the beginning is, and the foundations, the intellectual foundations for beginning to challenge that are very much here. And so some of you who have read my work will know that I'm very much interested and find very valuable the work of some of the French postmodern thinkers, particularly Michel Foucault, who has given us the tools. And in fact, in Islam for Western Eyes, I have an entire chapter called Foucault's Toolbox, which I believe gives readers a roadmap to what is extremely complicated material in ways to start to see that science, Western science we're talking about, is only one of many competing discourses. And so I think the first step to breaking down the hegemony, as Talal has called it, I think that's a good word, is to understand that it's only one of many pathways. It's not necessarily the only pathway or the dominant pathway or even the correct pathway. So I think when you look at the history of Western culture, you'll see that empiricism, scientific method, we have lots of words for it, were really embedded as intellectual and social practice in the 18th century. And so the book I'm working on now is about Carl Linnaeus, who developed the sort of modern approach to taxonomy, this notion that the world is divided into animals, plants, and minerals, and that there's a hierarchy in the natural world. And the problem, this gave science a very powerful impetus to move forward, but it also created some of the problems that Talal has referred to, which is it blocks out other forms of knowledge. And so the first step in deconstructing or in opposing a hegemonic understanding, in my view, would be to identify the nature of that hegemony. And that process has been done in many high-level intellectual circles, but I don't think it's penetrated into popular reading circles, and certainly not into undergraduate, high school curricula and courses. So we need to think about science much more critically. And of course, we have some examples and some reason to do so because of all the disasters, right? But I mean, that science, out of control science, has occasionally led the world into. We have pollution everywhere. We have atomic weapons. We have chemical weapons. We have a lot of problems in this world that were the direct sort of result of scientific inquiry without any moral or any ethical consideration. So what I assume from your question would be the effect of hegemonic empiricism is kind of there to see. Question then is how, and I don't have an answer for this, is how to kind of deconstruct that and take it down, except to show that what passes for modern science is only one understanding. And that's what I'm trying to do in my new book. So there are examples, there are examples from history, of course, that things that were not seen as important are suddenly important. And that's what I'm trying to get at in my book on taxonomy, which is the categories of knowledge that we create dictate how we're going to think into the future. And it's only when we start to break down those categories that we say, oh, wait a minute, there are other things we might be able to think about. So maybe I should move on to the other questions, if that's all right.
Well, we'd look very much forward for that book then, which may answer those questions very deeply, and we'll come back to them. We have a couple of questions here. I don't know if you see them. Do you see them? Do you have access to the Q&A, or should I?
No, I have access, but why don't you read it while I give it a little thought?
Okay, sure. So there's an anonymous viewer have asked, here I quote, we always hear that some of the famous Islamic scientists are not really Muslims. Some of them are considered as kuffars or even atheists, and they were killed. Why do you think? What do you think about this, and why did this happen? That's question one. Perhaps before we go on to question two.
Okay, fair enough. Let me just see if I can move this screen. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, many of the great religious scientific texts actually had a religious basis. So Al-Khwarizmi wrote an entire treatise on algebra that's basically aimed at enforcing and in deploying the very complex but very interesting Islamic rules on inheritance. So inheriting, someone dies, your father dies, the sons get so much and the daughters get so much and the son-in-laws get this, and there's a whole formula. And so someone has to figure out how to break this down. And so his algebraic work is actually integrated heavily into the enforcement and compliance with Islamic law. Of course, there were cases, often had to do with political opposition, but I really have trouble thinking of major Islamic scholars from the period that I'm interested in, which is basically the late 8th century into about the 14th century, who suffered for their work. I think that, and this is a whole other subject for an entire different talk and probably a different scholar, though I've worked on it, is one of the forces that the Islamic world really needs to come to terms with are its internal conflicts and the ways in which the West likes to see conservatives versus liberals and reformers versus traditionalists. But in fact, Islam is, and what makes it so powerful is that it's a vital religion. It's still living and it's still very much in flow and in flux. And without a hierarchy like the Catholic Church, which gets to say this is the way it is, you're going to have these tensions, and those tensions get expressed in political opposition, in scientific opposition, occasionally in war, in political violence. But I don't think that really any of the major scholars that I've studied died a political death that I can think of. One of them died, was killed by robbers on the highway in Central Asia, and things happen. But no, I don't think that. Some were branded infidels, but again, and I'm not really a scholar of Islam, so I can't give you chapter and verse, but my understanding and my research shows that, well, I should say my understanding is that these terms can be invoked often as a way of opposing someone, but within a religious context, there's a lot of flexibility within Islam. So this trend, takfir, is very, very elusive and really best left to religious scholars, not to scientific scholars like myself. But no, I don't think that that's actually the case, but I'd be happy to look at some examples.
That's well, thank you very much. There's, as you said, it's there can be differing views on the subject, but it's like Al-Khwarizmi's approach to his subject, and like many others, was for religious purposes, or things related to Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic approaches to natural order, be it prayer times or otherwise. I think where there has been some issues, I'm not sure if this is what our colleague here has been referring to, is where the conflict or the controversy is sometimes caused by matters of creed and not of things that relates to the natural order or inquiry into the natural world. There has been a lot of conflict before on things related to aqidah questions or matter of theology, and when such scholars have caused controversy. But I think, as you've said, it's potentially a different topic. We have another question here, also anonymous. What are the main Islamic values that you think the West could benefit from?
That's another good question. I'll start historically, and then I'll just freelance a little about my own time in the Muslim world.
Sure.
Historically, again, I've come around this, but I think this is, if you take one thing away from this talk, I would hope it would be this, and that is, and Talal also mentioned it, and that is the importance of permission, of taking on responsibility for understanding the natural world without challenging. It doesn't imply a challenge to God's supremacy. This was really the breakthrough that I think Adelard and people like him brought, that you're understanding the world. So if we back up a little and look at church history, one of the greatest figures in Western church history was St. Augustine. Augustine was a pagan who converted late in life to Christianity. wrote very eloquently about it and is extremely influential, as you probably know. At one point he says, you know, I no longer go to the theater. I don't care about the course of the stars. You know, I'm focused on the afterlife. I'm focused on my notion of being a good Christian, but I'm not interested in all that stuff around me. And this is the same time the Muslim world is saying, wait a minute, we can navigate by the stars. God built the stars. He built us as intelligent. He designed us as intelligent humans. We can use that signals. We can use that information to live better, to be better Muslims, to find Mecca, to pray in the right direction, or just to live our lives. So it's really a fundamental difference. So that's the historic contribution. When I lived in the Muslim world, and I lived in Turkey, I lived in Iran, I lived in Egypt, I've traveled probably to most countries. I've lived in Indonesia, so a little bit outside the traditional notion of the Arab Muslim world. I think a humanist, what always impressed me was the kind of depth of the intellectual depth of even simple people who are not highly educated, but had a deep appreciation for learning. I think that I hope is something that could be translated from an Islamic context to a Western context, because it feels very superficial when you come back after many years in the Muslim world. You come back, as I did, to America, to England, and then now I live on the West Coast. In America, life feels more material, and I would hope that elements of the Islamic world, and we see this in big cities and in modernizing or developing countries everywhere. Everyone wants to live well, and I don't have any criticism of people wanting to live a higher standard of living. But I think materialism is really a big problem in the West, and I'm hoping that maybe some of the instincts among the Muslim, particularly youth, to see other pathways besides material wealth would be a great contribution.
Okay, we have a few more questions. First, thank you for that beautiful answer. We have first, I'm going to read the question. Abdul Mu'min Muhammad Raad says, okay, so that's the name of the person. It says, is it true that the majority of the medieval Muslim scientists experienced extreme opposition from Orthodox clergy, like most of them were of the Mu'tazilas, and were criticized of their beliefs and practices? Is that a few pages booklet of Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of Philosophers impacted the advance of science, or Ibn Rushd's the incoherence of the incoherence, which is tahafut, was not sufficient to make its way into the Muslim world against Ghazali's ideas? So that's the first question. And before we go into there's 3 more questions we can come to. But just to emphasize on that, and perhaps elaborate more on what the question might be referring to. You mentioned that through your survey of the dominant notion that Al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, was one of the main reasons, or his thought and ideas were of primary influence to hinder the advancement of scientific inquiry, and him and his thought was a big obstacle in the institutionalization of science, or scientific inquiry, and for that sake. So Abdul Mu'min is asking, and in that context, is it really that those few pages from Al-Ghazali contributed to that decay, quote unquote, or is it not?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think that there are really lots of different ways of attacking that. But it's a very subtle question too, and thank you. In my view, it was not sufficient, but it is a very, historians, like storytellers everywhere, we love turning points, right? We want to point to something and say, that's the moment this happened. Mm-hmm. That's the moment Muslim science died. That's the moment the Vietnam War was lost, whatever phenomena you want to explain. My sense is that history, intellectual history in particular, doesn't really work that way. It is true that the incoherence of the incoherence did not have the impact that Ghazali's work did. The question would be, why is that? You have to look at the political history and the way that the political leadership of the Muslim world flirted with the Mutazilites and then turned its back on them. And so there were a lot of political cross currents. So I think it's easy to lose the trajectory of intellectual history inside the social and political history of the Muslim world at the time. It's also true that in Western historiography, a Ghazali moment is the key. That's it, done, we're done. Extremely influential Orientalist Goldseger wrote a whole essay about how Ghazali killed off Islamic science. There's a problem with that. And it gets back to my point about the unstudied manuscripts. Is there's enormous evidence, though it hasn't been studied very well, that scientific inquiry and activity continued almost unabated after the so-called Ghazali moment, particularly in India, but elsewhere, other parts of the Muslim world, if not necessarily in the sort of heartland. So again, you have to ask what is cause and what is effect, and simply what is symptom. I find it also interesting that another work of Averroes, on the harmony of religion and philosophy, similarly didn't seem to have quite the effect, but interestingly, it was never translated into Western languages until, I believe, the early 20th century. And so the same scholarly consensus that supports the Ghazali moment theory was completely unaware that there were at least competing ideas out there about how science and philosophy, that is, on the one hand, and religion on the other, could cohabit and work together. So we don't have a very good answer to that question. My inclination would be saying no, it was not simply, and Ghazali was a brilliant thinker, a brilliant writer. And his attack on cause and effect and some of his work on the philosophical, what he saw as philosophical weakness of the argument of the philosophers is extremely interesting. But no, I don't think it was sufficient on the one hand to stop forward momentum. And clearly, Averroes' response was not enough to counter that. So I'd say the jury is still open. But I want to step back and tell you that I have lectured about this topic in this book, in these books all around the world, 20% to mostly Muslim audiences and 80% to non-Muslim. And the question I always get from non-Muslims, I think, is very interesting, and I want to share with you. And in its crude form, it goes like this. So if you say, Jonathan, the Muslims were so great in the medieval period, why don't they have modern science and, whatever today? And I was very surprised by that question, but I've heard it so many times that I realized that there's this deep motivation for people asking. And these are not insincere people. I haven't done this lecture much in the Trump era, so I can't say what it's like out there these days. I'm working on my own projects and keeping my head down a little bit, but I realized that question tells me more about the person asking the question than it really tells me about the world. And so I used to say, well, let's step back from the Muslim world and let's think about the Greeks. We all know how great Greek science was, and it's taught to all of us, and we have Aristotle and Plato, and it is amazing stuff. But nobody comes around and says, wait a minute, Dr. Lyons, how come Greece is this tiny little country that's breaking the EU and Germans go there and drink beer? Nobody has ever asked me that question. So there are actually enormous cultural, political, sociological factors in the decline of Islamic science that have nothing to do with Islam as a faith. But Islam as a faith becomes the default Western answer. So I don't know, maybe that sheds a little light on my thinking and gives you some more to think about.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We have a bunch of questions. I'll try to summarize a few of them. First, a gentleman is asking, what is your opinion on the clash of civilizations, Samuel Huntington's theory, in the future context? Perhaps the question is referring to now and for future context. So that's one question. I'll give you another question, perhaps to see if you can think about both together before we move on to
a couple of Arabic questions I'll translate into English. So the first is a clash of civilization. What do you think of it currently and the future implications of it, or its potential future projection? And what made the Islamic era a golden age, as you've referred to as an age with a beginning, middle, and end? What made it be overlooked by the Western education and societal systems? And as you mentioned, that in schools you learned about Greek civilizations, but not about the Islamic civilization. So why do you think that Islamic science have been overlooked in the Western tradition? And I will come back to the Arabic questions, and I'll get them to a summary.
Let me start with the second question briefly, because I think I hinted at it, but I need to be more clear. There is in Western thought, in my opinion, an inability to see the Islamic world as a creative force. So we don't find what we don't look for. We stumble over something that we can't understand. We just move on. That's human nature. And so Islamic achievements are generally downplayed as translations of the Greeks, caretakers of classical wisdom, maybe the odd contribution of something here or there, but it has to do with the broader antipathy of Western culture for the Muslim world, largely grounded, and I think a lot of people don't understand this, in what an enormous threat Islam as an intellectual, religious, and social force posed to medieval Western interests. It was an extremely dynamic community. I mean, you know the history of the Islamic world better than I do, but I mean, we have Muhammad. After the revelation, it's how many generations that we have this global empire. Western Christendom saw the Muslims as a very serious rival, intellectual rival, economic rival, political rival, and of course, religious rival. And the response was to try to negate everything of value within the Islamic world. So we don't study the Golden Age because there couldn't really be much of a Golden Age because it's only Islam. I mean, I know it sounds crude, but I think that, and if you want the kind of intellectual take on it, I really would direct you towards my book, Islam Through Western Eyes, because I really lay out, and I don't have time to do it now, the progression, the discovery of Islam by the West, a brief period of sort of love affair with Islamic culture, a backlash, which has continued from, the 1400s to today. And what interests me about this discourse of Islam in the West is that it hasn't changed. Normal intellectual history of science, we have an idea and we have facts. The facts support the idea, and then the facts change because, oops, the sun is the center of the universe. So now we have to change the theory. We get a new theory. Facts don't seem to change anything about the Muslim world. And I noticed this when I was a correspondent. Talal mentioned I worked for Reuters, and I was in Iran for a number of years. I was in Turkey for many years. The mainstream journalists, the famous journalists, and the famous newspapers, they come there with a set idea of what they're going to find. They find it, and they tell their readers they found it, and they go home to something else. And those of us who really tried, and I may have failed, but I really tried to understand the culture in its own terms, were criticized very heavily. And if you want to have fun and Google me and my former wife, Genevieve Abdu, and the problems we had with the Iranians, but also with the Westerners about our reporting, it's a kind of a fun story. It's fun now that it's 20 years old. These are uncomfortable truths for a lot of people on all sides. So that's why we don't study it. Clash of Civilizations, briefly. You got to remember the history of that essay. When it was first written, it was ridiculed in academia. It was ridiculed. And also, it was published in Foreign Affairs by Samuel Huntington, and it was called Clash of Civilizations, ? When he developed it as a book, he lost the question mark, and he became much more confident because it seemed to, in the eyes of the layman and many academics, it seemed to explain the current state of East-West relations. It didn't, in my view. It's a gross misunderstanding of the role of culture. So no, but it's almost been taken for granted. What's ironic and painful for me is the degree to which radical opinion in the Muslim world has adopted some of the same positions and same ideas as what I would call radical anti-Muslim positions in the Western world. So the misunderstanding of the word jihad and the use of jihadi is a good example. Now we have both sides, if you will, using this term in a historically and religiously inappropriate way, but they agree on what it means for them. So that's a little comment.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I was gonna do the same with the first part of the question and referring to our friends and colleagues to the first chapter, or the chapter on Islam and Science in the book Islam to Westernize. It outlines beautifully that that approach as you've laid it out from the beginning, the discovery, the translation movement, and then what came afterwards, and how this eventually evolved as in just to the approach they have now. There's a question that shifts slightly away from the historical narrative to a question of ethics. And here it's a question in Arabic I'm translating into English. And forgive me if I butcher the question or if I misrepresent the question. The person is asking, another anonymous colleague, what are the problems, what are the ethical and moral problems that relate to the human composition and human biology? As today, there's a huge trend in human genetic modification. What is the position of Western and Islamic values from such controversial issues? And here I end the question. And add, just as a follow-up, but you've mentioned prior that there's a huge problem of the news that the new modern science without any moral values and without any roots without any roots that anchors it, causes and manifests itself in problems like the World War, the huge technological advancement causing the development of mass killing machines or mass weaponry. We see a lot of dehumanization trends through technology in different ways. So how is it that the question of values or lack thereof from science, how would that manifest itself into the question of the human being? And particularly here in this question in relation to biology and genetic modification. Jonathan, I think you're muted. You might have muted yourself. Okay.
I apologize. I did. Thank you for the question. That is probably, people who know me and know my teaching know that I'm not afraid to say when I don't know something. So I'm going to say that I really don't know, but let me give you some thoughts to maybe help you try to think it through, because I think it's a very important question. I've been writing and researching a lot about Facebook and Google and social media and the way that it embeds certain ways of thinking and polarizes communities, particularly here in the States, but in the West in general and everywhere. And what I realize is that the engineers who brought us these products, like the biologists you're referring to, seem to have been educated, raised, trained, whatever, outside of the great philosophical, ethical traditions that everyone on this call, on this program, we share, whether we're Muslims, Christians, Jews, or whatever. So I think we're getting science completely disconnected from other concerns of life. One of the reasons is institutional. It's very hard to become a cutting-edge scientist these days in any country without studying full-time and devoting yourself only to, say, the study of physics. And so my father was a college professor. He passed away 10 years ago at the age of 90-something. He was an economist. but he could play the violin like a dream. He knew art, he knew science, he knew culture, he knew history. He was very educated. And I'm finding more and more of my colleagues and the next generation beneath us so specialized, so focused on very narrow questions that liberal arts, of which I'm a great proponent, really have been slighted, particularly by the science, technical, or the STEM, so-called STEM subjects. So I think this disconnect between being a successful entrepreneur, tech entrepreneur or scientist or geneticist on the one hand, and having some sort of ethical grounding is really dangerous. And we're seeing the results of that.
Would that then be a question of education reform, for example, or infusing some form of moral teaching into institutions that commonly host those people? Like, where should institutionalizing that or would be a key to really avoiding that catastrophic event or catastrophic detachment between values and specialties?
I think it would. And I think one way to sell that, if you will, to the participants is to remind them that in many ways the greatest breakthroughs in human, say in technology or in science, are not made by specialists. There's a very well-known phenomenon called the outsider effect, which is either young physicists or people from other fields come into physics and make breakthrough achievements. Why? Well, because they haven't been socialized, institutionalized to the culture of the scientific discipline in which they're in. So yes, I think broadening the educational exposure, but also maybe putting a little less emphasis on specialization as an end in itself would be a way to do it. I think I might be losing my voice, so we may have to synthesize I don't want to be rude.
Sorry, can you say that again? The line was cutting off, Jonathan.
I said, I think I may be losing my voice, so we may have to wrap up fairly soon, with your permission.
Okay, shall we take I'll just one last question, and we can wrap it up. We have 3 questions that we haven't answered yet, but
let's try to do them. Let's try to do them quickly. I don't want to be rude to anybody who's been polite enough to submit a question.
Sure. Okay, so we have a question first from Ahmed Helmi, and here I'm not taking them in chronological order, like in the way that you've submitted.
Or you can synthesize them, whatever you want to do.
Okay, sure. So Ahmed says, a few days ago I saw a lecture about Islam by a Western scholar. The lecture was positive, but incurred in several mistakes in the understanding of Islam and Islamic history and the Quran. And I think that the reason for this ignorance is the Arabic language and to be satisfied with the translations of the Quran. This is a bad thing since for Arabic, one verse may have 10 meanings, while the translation only carries 1. What do you think is the solution? And how can we potentially highlight this issue for Western scientists or Western scholars of Islam? And I would imagine Ahmed is referring to. So that's the first question. You can briefly touch upon it. So do you think the language is a potential barrier for people studying Islam or studying the Quran, or what? So that's question 1.
Well, you've put me on the spot because my Arabic is not good enough to do original research, and I would say that openly. In fact, if you read my writings really carefully, you'll see that I'm not arguing that I am an expert in Islam or even Islamic science. I am looking at its secondary effects as it cascades, excuse me, through Western culture. But of course, I've tried to educate myself as well as I can. Of course, the Quran the revelations were made in Arabic, they were recorded in Arabic. The idea of translating the Quran, as you know, is controversial in some circles. I find a general problem with scholarship is the phenomenon we call cherry picking, where you find a quotation from the Quran or from the Bible or from the New York Times or whatever that fits your argument. And you pull it out, and there you are. There's not a good answer to that, except we have to be very careful that we're actually going for the spirit of the text. But I will tell you a story. Many years ago, I was a Reuters correspondent in Moscow. It was my first foreign appointment. And it was time Gorbachev was was the leader of the Soviet Union, and eventually we had the coup, and et cetera, et cetera. But my boss had been there 20 years and really knew the Soviet Union and was a very good Russian speaker. And when I first showed up, he said, Jonathan, I know you speak Russian, which I do, but we are not translators, we are interpreters. Never forget that. And I think that is great, because translation is different from interpretation. Interpretation is hard. Translation, pretty soon computers can do it. But if you've ever tried to do a computer translation, you'll see just how bad interpretation can be. So yes, that is a problem. But even if the scholar in question spoke perfect Arabic and understood the nuance, it's so easy to cherry pick any text like that. People do it all the time.
We're very well put. A couple of more questions. We have Yusuf first asking, Yusuf and Naimi, that you refer to Christianity or the epistemology of Christianity, that it divides the universe, or it views the universe on the basis of a pyramid and deals with it on that basis. So in that context, how does Islam divides the world or views the world? And again, here the question ends, but here I would want to ask that, yes, as you've referred to, you're not a scholar of Islam, but you deal with the with its byproducts or the repercussions of it, be it in the field of, be it in knowledge or science or in other fields. So yeah, you can think about the questions. I'm going to ask you the second question as well, so you can think about both and see how you'd like to summarize them. So the second question is about from an anonymous, and the question states, someone would say all the developments that happened in the Islamic world was because of a good life conditions that were provided, and good life conditions may be provided on the Islamic regime or in the Islamic world or any other world. So why do we refer to Islam when we talk about those inventions and developments? It's like, so yeah. So the gentleman here is playing the devil's advocate in the question. So some people would argue that yes, it's a matter of good life conditions. There was wealth at the Abbasid time, and they were provided the tools and instruments were facilitated and provided for them. The House of Wisdom, for example, because there was a political will to create an institution like Bayt al-Hikmah and to provide financial support, which allowed automatically, or that's what one can argue, for all that advancement in science, because there was investment and there was political will towards that direction. So how does that differ when we talk about atheist scientists? So this is the second question we have.
Well, believe it or not, I would actually agree with the question in the sense that, from my opinion, from my point of view, the rise and the fall and the changes of Islamic science were not explained by religion, but in fact, as Talal very well put it, by cultural, economic, and political factors. So it became state policy of the Abbasids to pursue science. If you wanted to get ahead at the Abbasid court, you had to either be a scholar, or if you couldn't be a scholar because you didn't have the talent or the time or the intelligence, you could hire a scholar to write a book. You would pay for it, and this would enhance your prestige. Even some of the wives of in the harem of the Sultan became quite well educated and studied and produced scientific texts. It was an acceptable way to get ahead in Abbasid society. So, yes. And getting back to my question that the Westerners always ask me as well, if the Muslims are so smart, how come they're so poor today, or whatever version they want to ask? It disregards the sociological, the political, the economic effects that we see throughout history. So, for example, I'm not sure how many people even in the Muslim world know this, but Iraq, around Baghdad and the whole area, was an enormous granary for Eastern Mediterranean. Why? Well, they had this extremely sophisticated system of irrigation. Now, if you think about it, a system of irrigation requires a top-down authoritarian power because it requires coordination, water systems, of land use, of rules, of husbandry. So when that starts to break down through political breakdown, sociological breakdown, invasion, such as the Mongol invasion, that gets destroyed. It never gets rebuilt. Desertification sets in. Iraq doesn't look today like it looked in the Abbasid period. It could never have supported such an enormous empire if it did. So these changes, the history of the Chinese empire is very cyclical. You have Chinese emperors, nomads come in from Central Asia, depose the emperors, become the new emperors. Within a generation or two, they've adopted many of the sort of decadent cultural qualities of their predecessors, and a new group of Mongols come in and defeat them. And so decadence could be an explanation for the fall of Islamic science, invasion, economic change, climate change. And there are lots, my point is not that we know, but that we don't acknowledge it could be anything but Islam. So in that sense, I do agree with the question. As to the first question, again, that is kind of out of my realm, but I want to tell you a fun story, and I think we'll wrap up with this. One of the greatest debates in medieval Christian science is the question of the eternity of the world. Is the world eternal, or was it created in time? Enormous, contentious point in Western culture, Christian, I'm talking about church culture, Western European culture. Didn't cause the Muslims really any problem at all. So Thomas Aquinas gets engaged. Long story short is the Arabs argue that, and Averroes in particular, that of course the universe is eternal. It must be coterminous with God, because if it's not eternal, then God woke up one day and said, you know what this world needs is a universe. Well, that implies that God, who's perfect, had a change of mind. How is that possible, he asks. It's a very good question. Thomas Aquinas was smart enough to realize that Catholic teaching was that God created Earth at a given time. But he also was smart enough to realize that there was no real argument, no response to Averroes and the Arab philosophers that could win the argument. So he cheated. He said, well, wait a minute. Let's not argue that. Let's just say that the fact that God created the universe in time is an article of faith for all Catholics, and you have to believe it. So that was his solution. He had a lot of pushback from others. He said, no, the Arabs are wrong, blah, 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 blah. But in fact, what I call the Aquinas compromise survived, and it laid the foundation for Western science and Western religion to kind of move on these tracks that had very little interaction if they could help it, because every time they interacted, they got into trouble. We had Galileo, Copernicus. But I think it all started with Aquinas, who basically said, logically, yes, but religiously, no. That's not a distinction that, in my experience, serious Muslim scholars make that distinction. They don't need to make that distinction because it didn't cause a problem for them. So I don't think that addresses your question, but I hope that gives you some more to think about and some things to read about. And if anyone wants to follow up with me, Talal can give them, you're fine to give them my email.
Absolutely.
You can take it on your own. I've just developed a new website. I'm starting a new book project, and today you can't be an author without a website. So my old website was kind of bad, so I'm making a new one. So I'll pass that all along to Talal.
Yes, we'll be sharing. Yeah, we're going to be sharing the link. We've shared the link to the existing link for the books and for all the books in the new website that you've published, as well as the Twitter handle and the links for the 4 books that you have so far. And we look forward to the upcoming one. And the last point that you've alluded to, the question of time and the creation of the universe, I think this is a huge subject which requires a session by its own.
It would be fun. I want to do it. I'd be happy to come.
Yeah, and I would love to have that. Potentially, the medium that we're using today is a bit limiting, and it definitely has its constraints. But it was a huge pleasure to have you with us, and we really hope that in the future we'll have other mediums, and surely a physical one,
right.
That we can be in the same place and exchange ideas more intimately. Hopefully, whether be it in Istanbul, if you have a chance to visit, or in other places. But potentially a start of a conversation that
is to be continued at a later time in another place, hopefully here in a place that you've spent over 20 years of your life in. So on behalf of my colleagues and the Sharq and Youth Forum, I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Yalla, thank you very much. And we'll be wrapping up and have a good night, or have a good day since